a tall man with a precisely groomed mustache to the ship's purser. Ensure their valuables are handled with the utmost discretion. A flicker of recognition sparked in Marple's mind. The Ashbournes, once among the most wished names in high society, had recently been the subject of whispered scandals and financial ruin. Yet here they were, aboard one of the most luxurious ocean liners, boasting possession of an artifact of almost mythical allure, the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic, a sapphire of extraordinary size and unfathomable worth. A daring display, considering their circumstances. The man whom she now identified as Curtis Ashbourne turned and met her gaze. His nod was polite, yet behind it lurked something guarded, something unspoken. Marple returned the gesture with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to playing the game. Filing the encounter away, she proceeded to her cabin, an understated yet comfortable space, its porthole framing the ever-expanding horizon. But peace, she knew, was an illusion. A quiet stroll along the promenade deck revealed more than she anticipated. The air was bracing, the rhythmic sway of the ship almost lulling, when a young steered, as if materializing from the wind itself. His face was pleasant enough, but shadowed by unease. He hesitated, twisting his cap in his hands before finally speaking, his voice low. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you're the detective, aren't you? The one from the papers?" Marple tilted her head, feigning modesty. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, but I have been known to untangle a mystery or two." The steward glanced around, his hands tightening over the fabric of his uniform. "There's talk below deck, ma'am, about that sapphire. Some say it's cursed. Others," he swallowed hard, lowering his voice further, "others say someone plans to steal it." Marple's gaze sharpened imperceptibly. "And what do you believe?" The young man exhaled, his breath carrying the weight of something he dared not voice. "I believe there's too much at stake, for the family, for everyone." Another quick glance over his shoulder, then a rushed whisper. "Keep your eyes open, ma'am, that's all I'll say." And before she could press him further, he was gone, vanishing into the tide of passengers. Marple remained, her gloved fingers tracing the ship's railing as she gazed into the infinite blue. A cursed sapphire, a ship brimming with secrets, and now a whisper of impending theft. The pieces were falling into place. She had come aboard expecting a quiet voyage. Instead she had stepped into the heart of a storm yet to break. Smiling faintly to herself, she turned back toward the gleaming corridors of the SS Illustrium, where polished luxury masked the undercurrents of deception, and where, if experience had taught her anything, a crime was already in motion. The dense fog curled over the Southampton docks like ghostly fingers, swallowing the lamplight and muffling the restless symphony of shouting deckhands, clattering trunks, and the low, mournful wail of the SS Avalon's horn. The towering ocean liner, its hull glistening with beads of mist, stood like a slumbering giant, poised to cut through the Atlantic with all the elegance and secrecy of a whispered promise. Among the hurried passengers and harried porters, a solitary assurance of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Miss Agatha Marple, wrappable grey travelling coat with a modest hat pinned at an angle of calculated practicality, clutched a small leather handbag, her only apparent luggage. But it was her eyes, sharp and unwavering behind steel-rimmed glasses, that told the true story. They moved with the precision of a scalpel, dissecting the throng with a detached curiosity. A porter staggered beneath the weight of an extravagant trunk, his curses swallowed by the din, while a woman swathed in furs clicked her tongue in exasperation. "Mind yourself, man, that contains valuables beyond your understanding." Her voice was crisp, tinged with entitlement. Beside her, a tall man with silver at his temples cast a wary glance at the trunk before adjusting his gloves with a deliberate slowness. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. She had seen such glances before, that revealed more than words ever could. And then there was the daughter, barely more than a wisp of a girl, clutching her handbag as though it contained something precious, her eyes darting like a rabbit caught in open ground. The Ashbury family, Miss Marple noted with mild interest, the name as familiar to the scandal pages as it was to whispers of misfortune. Their fabled sapphire, a jewel of legendary beauty and purported curse, had been secured aboard this very vessel for a grand exhibition, or so the papers claimed. Miss Marple, however, had never trusted what was written for the masses. Truth, she had learned, rarely sat so neatly upon the surface. As she ascended the gangway, the cold brine of the sea mingled with the scent of coal smoke and expensive perfume, a contrast as stark as the social divide among the ship's passengers. Inside, the Avalon's grand foyer was a spectacle of gold and mahogany, where chandeliers weighed in elegant defiance of the ocean's pull. The hum of conversation rippled through the air, fragments of travel plans, boasts of wealth, and hushed speculations about the sapphire. "A cursed gem, they say," one woman whispered behind a gloved hand, companion shivering in the warmth. "Every family that's owned it has ruined. It's loud. They parade it about." Reasonable question, Miss Marple, though she suspected the answer lay not in arrogance, but in desperation. Wealth had a peculiar way of slipping through the fingers of those who grasped it too tightly. She stepped aside as the Ashburys made their entrance, Lord Ashbury leading with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Lady Ashbury followed, her movements deliberate, her expression a mask of composure, but it was Cordelia, their daughter, who intrigued Miss Marple most. There was a tremor in the girl's step, an uncertainty in the way she held herself, as though she carried an unseen weight. And then, just as the family moved past, a whisper of movement, a figure cloaked in the shifting crowd, watching the Ashburys with an intent that sent a flicker of unease down Miss Marple's spine. The ship's polished brass might gleam, and the laughter of the privileged might ring through its halls, but beneath the surface, the first ripples of something darker had already begun. The dense fog clung to the Southampton docks like a ghostly veil, swirling in lazy tendrils around the hurried feet of porters, heaving trunks and crates onto the colossal gangway. The mournful bellow of the SS Celestia's horn split the thick morning air, a sound both commanding and foreboding, as if heralding the beginning of something far more than a simple voyage. Voices, some clipped with authority, others thick with exhaustion, melded into the rhythmic cacophony of an embarkation well underway. Passengers in finely tailored coats and extravagant hats paraded up the gangway, their boots striking a steady rhythm against the steel, unaware or perhaps willfully ignorant of the weight of history pressing upon this voyage. At the periphery of the commotion stood Miss Evelyn Harrow, her modest grey travelling suit perfectly pressed, her gloved fingers curled around the worn handle of a small leather handbag, the only luggage she deemed necessary. To an untrained eye, she was merely another unassuming woman, perhaps a governess or a widow of modest means. But those who knew her, or rather those unfortunate enough to cross her path, understood that behind those observant eyes lay a mind as sharp as a scalpel. Her gaze flitted across the scene with quiet precision, noting details that others dismissed. The subtle tremor in a steward's hands as he struggled with a particularly weighty trunk, the nervous flick of a young woman's eyes toward the imposing silhouette of a man who, until now, had remained motionless in the mist. The almost imperceptible way Lord Charles Blackwood's hand tightened around his silver-tipped cane as a uniformed officer approached him. Ah, so it begins. The Blackwood family, their name once synonymous with unimaginable wealth and prestige, now teetered on the precipice of ruin. Decades of poor investments and quiet scandals had drained their coffers, and yet here they were, stepping onto the most luxurious ocean liner of the decade, as if their aristocratic blood alone was enough to buoy them above financial collapse. At the heart of their charade lay their last great possession, the starlight sapphire, a gem so exquisite, so steeped in history, that men had killed for less. Tonight it was to be unveiled at a grand gala, a spectacle meant to solidify the Blackwoods' place among the elite once more. But to those who understood the nature of greed, of ambition, of desperation, it was clear something would go terribly wrong. Miss Harrow ascended the gangway with measured steps, her gaze momentarily drawn to the thick mist curling along the water's surface. A trick of the light perhaps, but for the briefest moment, She thought she saw a second shadow within her own, a flicker of movement just beyond the edges of perception, and then it was gone. Once aboard, the grandeur of the SS Celestia unfolded before her. Polished mahogany gleamed beneath the glow of chandeliers, their golden light refracting in crystalline brilliance. The air was thick with the scent of fresh roses, cigar smoke, and the faintest trace of salt. Wealth draped itself across every inch of the ship, from the intricate gold leaf embellishments to the murmured conversations laced with feigned indifference. Miss Harrow moved like a spectre through the foyer, listening, watching. Whispers brushed against her ears as she passed. They say the sapphire is cursed. No one who possesses it keeps it for long. A nervous laugh, a dismissive scoff. Lord Blackwood entered moments later, his every movement calculated, his expression a carefully crafted mask of composure. Beside him, Lady Margaret Blackwood's lips pressed into a thin line, her beaded clutch held so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. And behind them, moving with an almost imperceptible hesitation, was their daughter Lillian Blackwood. Unlike her parents, Lillian was no actress. Her unease was palpable, manifesting in the restless way her fingers toyed with the delicate chain around her throat. She was watching someone, or perhaps waiting for something. Miss Harrow tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. The pieces were already in motion, the undercurrents of deception, of fear, running deeper than they seemed. And as the final call for boarding rang out across the docks, she had the strangest feeling that this voyage would be anything but ordinary. The SS Celestia shuddered as it pulled away from the shore, the mist swirling in its wake as though reluctant to release its hold. Below, figures on the dock faded into obscurity, their cheers and farewells swallowed by the hum of the engines. And in the distance, beneath the shadow of the great ship, a lone figure stood unmoving, watching, waiting. By nightfall, someone would be dead. To her lips. And then, as if on cue, the Langford family made their entrance. Lord Sebastian Langford, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, moved with the bearing of a man who had once commanded respect, but now carried the weight of something unseen, a burden carefully hidden behind an impeccably tailored suit. Beside him, Lady Vivian Langford, draped in pearls and the illusion of effortless grace, smiled in the way only women accustomed to secrets could. Their daughter, Miss Clara Langford, followed a step behind, her delicate features set in a mask of composure, but there was something in her gaze, something restless, searching. Their arrival sent a ripple through the crowd, a shift in the atmosphere so subtle that only the most observant would notice. And Miss Graves noticed everything. The steward who approached them bowed slightly lower than necessary, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Lord Langford's nod was curt, his fingers tightening over the railing just briefly before he let go, as though steadying himself. Lady Langford's gloved hands smoothed over her gown, a gesture too precise to be unconscious. Miss Clara hesitated at the base of the stairs, her eyes flickering toward the far end of the room where a shadowed figure slipped through a side corridor unnoticed by most, but not by Miss Graves. And then, as the family moved deeper into the gathering, a voice from the corner reached her ears. "I heard the estate's drowning in debt, and that sapphire, their last gamble, a cursed gem some say," another voice whispered. "Every owner met with misfortune, and now they bring it here? A temptation, don't you think?" The words hung in the air like a discordant note in the waltz. Miss Graves did not turn toward the speakers, nor did she linger. There was no need. The seed of suspicion had already been planted. As the ship's horn bellowed its final call, and the SS Elysium set sail into the night, the glittering world within its walls continued, oblivious to the darkness gathering beneath the surface. And Miss Eleanor Graves, with a faint knowing smile, stepped into the swirling tide of passengers, her mind already weaving the strands of a mystery that had only just begun. A sharp chime rang through the lavish halls of the SS Elysium, its crisp note cutting through the low hum of conversation like the strike of a blade. Stewards moved with quiet efficiency, their white-gloved hands gesturing passengers toward their designated muster stations for the mandatory safety drill. The grand foyer, which only moments ago had been a sea of effortless elegance and polite murmurs, shifted as guests reluctantly obeyed, their laughter and conversation growing momentarily louder before dissipating into the ship's corridors. Miss Eleanor Graves, ever composed, followed at an unhurried pace, her sensible heels tapping lightly against the polished marble floor. Near the base of the grand staircase, her sharp gaze flicked toward a fleeting moment, a flash of discord in an otherwise choreographed world. Lord Langford, his typically controlled expression momentarily fraying, gestured sharply toward his wife, his voice too low to hear but his tension unmistakable. Lady Vivian Langford, whose every movement was usually precise and poised, clutched the fabric of her gown a fraction too tightly before smoothing it down with practiced grace. The exchange lasted only a breath before they retreated back into their carefully constructed facades, but to Miss Graves, it was a whisper of something unraveling beneath the surface. The ship had barely set sail, and already secrets were stirring. As the passengers were guided toward the promenade deck, the air grew crisper, the scent of salt mingling with the faint trace of expensive perfumes still clinging to the departing crowd. The ocean stretched into endless darkness, the last traces of sunlight dissolving into the horizon, but inside the SS Elysium, the night was only beginning. In the Grand Salon, a space designed for admiration and indulgence, chandeliers cast golden reflections onto the polished parquet floors, their glow competing with the deepening dusk outside the tall windows. A jazz trio on the small stage warmed up their instruments, the tentative notes weaving through the murmurs of anticipation. At the room's center, velvet ropes encircled a raised display case, its glass pristine, its purpose undeniable. Soon, it would house the famed azure star, a sapphire of legendary worth and whispered curses, set to be unveiled in an exhibition that had already ignited more speculation than the voyage itself. Seated at an unassuming table along the room's edge, Miss Graves stirred a cup of tea she had long forgotten, her focus instead on the currents of movement around her. Lord Langford stood rigidly by the display case, overseeing the final preparations with the air of a man desperately holding something together. He checked the placement of security detail, his fingers twitching against the cuff of his sleeve in an otherwise unreadable gesture. Lady Langford, adorned in an emerald gown that shimmered with every slow step, drifted among the guests with a smile that never quite softened her eyes. And Miss Clara Langford, youthful and radiant in silver, moved through the room with a delicate grace that did little to mask the way her gaze repeatedly sought out the display case, as if she were drawn to it by some unseen force. Just as Miss Graves made note of this, another figure entered the room, his presence quiet yet undeniably magnetic. Edward Calloway, tall, impeccably dressed, and moving with the ease of a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once, scanned the crowd with an interest that was too sharp to be casual. There was something in his gaze, an analytical precision that Miss Graves recognized in herself, a man who observed more than he spoke. He approached her table with a slow, deliberate confidence, inclining his head in greeting before speaking in a voice as smooth as the champagne being poured at the bar. "A remarkable evening, wouldn't you say?" His tone was light, but his eyes carried the weight of something unsaid, though I suspect for some, it may prove to be an evening of unforeseen complications. Miss Graves regarded him with a faint smile, her own voice measured. "Complications, Mr. Calloway." He returned the smile, though it never quite reached his eyes. A gem of that magnitude has a way of attracting the wrong sort of interest. Desperation, greed, recklessness. It's a dangerous combination, don't you think? She let a brief pause linger before replying, her fingers resting lightly against the rim of her cup. Human nature, Mr. Calloway, has always been far more dangerous than any jewel. A sapphire cannot plot. His chuckle was low, but the flicker of amusement in his expression was fleeting. His gaze drifted toward the display case, where Lord Langford now stood stiffly beside the ship's security personnel. "True enough," Calloway mused. "But I believe the plotting has already begun," and as the evening unfolded, the SS Elysium sailed further into the unknown, its passengers unaware that before the night was over, the brilliance of the azure star would not be the only thing to vanish into mystery. The grand salon of the SS Elysium had transformed into a mesmerizing stage, where chandeliers cast fractured reflections upon the gilded walls, and the delicate clink of crystal glasses wove into an uneasy harmony. The guests sat in breathless anticipation, their eyes locked onto the velvet-draped pedestal at the center of the room. Tonight, they would witness the unveiling of one of the most legendary jewels in existence, the Azure Heart, a sapphire of such rare beauty that its history was steeped in both admiration and whispered rumors of misfortune. Yet, amidst the thrill of expectation, there was one observer who was watching with an entirely different intent. Miss Eleanor Graves, seated at the periphery of the room, sipped her now cold tea, her sharp gaze moving from face to face, tracing every glance, every hesitant gesture, every flicker of tension hidden beneath well-rehearsed smiles. The true mystery, after all, was never the jewel itself, it was the people surrounding it. At the center of the spectacle stood Lord Alistair Langford, the evening's host, and the patriarch of a family whose fortunes were rumored to be teetering on the edge. Clad in a perfectly tailored suit, he carried himself with the composure of a man accustomed to control, though his hands betrayed him, fingertips pressing just a fraction too tightly against the velvet cloth that concealed the sapphire. "My esteemed guests," he began, his voice a measured blend of authority and charm, "it is both a privilege and an honor to share with you a treasure beyond mere wealth, a piece of history, a legacy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some leaned forward, anticipation glinting in their eyes. Others, the more discerning, exchanged quiet whispers, as if weighing the truth of his words. Lady Genevieve Langford, resplendent in an emerald gown that shimmered with every movement, stood beside her husband, her lips curved in the perfect smile of a dutiful hostess. But Miss Eleanor saw the subtle tension in her fingers, the way they clutched her bejeweled clutch just a little too tightly. And then there was their daughter, Celeste Langford, whose youthful grace was marred only by the way her gaze kept flickering toward the pedestal, drawn to it as if by an unseen force. Then, just as Lord Langford reached for the velvet drape, ready to unveil the Azure Heart, the unexpected happened. A sharp, shattering crash split the air. One of the towering mirrors lining the salon fractured with a deafening crack, shards exploding onto the polished floor. Gasps and startled cries rippled through the room as guests recoiled in shock. For a fraction of a second, the entire salon stood frozen, breaths caught in collective suspense, and yet, Lord Langford did not flinch. Miss Eleanor Graves narrowed her eyes, a reaction as controlled as his in such a moment. Either he had nerves of steel, or he had expected this. The chaos unfurled in waves, stewards rushed forward, guests clutched at their pearls, some murmuring of ill omens, but Miss Eleanor was no longer watching them. Her attention had locked onto one singular truth: the jewel was still untouched, still shimmering beneath its glass case, and yet, a crime had already begun. The moment Lord Alistair Langford pulled away the velvet covering with a practiced flourish, the Azure Heart was revealed in all its splendor. A collective gasp swept through the salon as the immense sapphire caught the light, its deep blue facets shimmering with an almost hypnotic pulse, as if the gem itself was breathing. It was not merely beautiful, it was alive, a glimmering artifact that had outlived kings, empires, and perhaps even its rightful owners. The jewel sat upon a silk-lined pedestal, encased in reinforced glass, yet to Miss Eleanor Graves, seated at the periphery, it might as well have been a baited trap. She was not watching the sapphire, she was watching them. A hush settled over the room as Lord Langford continued his speech, extolling the rich history of the Azure Heart, but Eleanor paid him little mind. Instead, her gaze swept across the gathered guests, reading their expressions like a well-worn novel. Faces painted in admiration, some in greed, others in calculation. Near the back, a figure shifted. Victor Harrow, a financier with a reputation as sharp as his features, stood with arms crossed, his lips a thin, unreadable line. Unlike the others, he was at the jewel. His eyes darted toward the exit, assessing routes, measuring escape. Interesting. Meanwhile at the front, Lady Genevieve Langford sat stiffly in her chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath her gloves. Not far from her, their daughter, Celeste, looked mesmerized, unable to take her eyes off the sapphire. A family so accustomed to grandeur, yet something in their posture betrayed them. They were afraid, but of what? Then just for a second, the room shifted. A waiter stumbled, his tray tilting precariously. A glass toppled, shattering against the floor in a sharp crack that startled the gathered elite. A minor accident, nothing more. Yet the way Lord Langford's head snapped toward the sound, his jaw tightening just slightly before forcing an indulgent smile, made Eleanor's fingers tighten around the handle of her teacup. He was already on edge, not the reaction of a man proudly unveiling his family's prized jewel, but of a man expecting something to go wrong, and then it did. The lights flickered, just once. A half-second of darkness, enough to steal the breath from the room. When they came back, Victor Harrow was gone. A murmur rippled through the guests, but Eleanor was already moving. The music resumed, the nervous laughter began, and the illusion of security was restored. But she knew better, she always knew better. The azure heart was still there, glistening in its case, untouched. And yet the real crime had just begun. The chandeliers flickered once, a brief, hesitant gasp of light, and then, with an eerie finality, darkness swallowed the grand salon whole. A murmur rippled through the crowd, an uneasy wave of whispers and held breaths. Somewhere, a champagne flute shattered, the crisp sound like a gunshot in the hush. The ship's engines droned beneath them, steady and indifferent, the only constant in the sudden void. Then came a voice, firm but laced with tension. "Stay calm, Lord Everett Blackwood." Even in the dark his authority was unmistakable. But Miss Evelyn Hargrave, who had been waiting for this moment, did not need sight to know that control had already slipped from his grasp. A second passed, then another. The darkness stretched too long, a deliberate, manufactured absence. Evelyn sharpened her senses, filtering through the noise, the shuffle of expensive shoes, the hush of fabric, a chair scraping too suddenly, a breath caught just before release. Someone was moving with purpose, then light, the chandeliers roared back to life, illuminating a room no longer the same. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Evelyn's gaze had already found the space at the heart of the salon, the pedestal encased in reinforced glass, bathed in its private spotlight. The sapphire was gone. A second of stunned silence, then the room erupted. "Impossible!" Lord Blackwood's voice cracked with disbelief as he lunged for the display, hands splayed against the untouched glass. The cushion within lay hollow, a velvet void where the celestial tear, a sapphire so rare it had never been appraised, only whispered about, had rested just moments ago. Lady Blackwood let out a choked gasp, clutching at the pearls at her throat, while their daughter, Genevieve, swayed, her complexion turned deathly pale. "It's gone," someone murmured, horror lacing their voice. It was right there. The Blackwoods weren't the only ones reacting. Evelyn was watching the others. Near the back of the room, Julian Wakefield remained curiously still, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. At the far corner, a steward stumbled onto the stage, his face ashen. I saw someone," he stammered, pointing toward the dim edge of the room. Just before the lights returned, a shadow. "They must have," he trailed off, the weight of accusation in the air. "Absurd," snapped Lord Blackwood. The case was locked, secured, but his certainty wavered, his hand still resting against the glass. No cracks, no forced entry, no sign of intrusion. Captain Elias Montrose arrived swiftly, his crisp uniform adding an air of authority to the rising unease. His voice carried across the salon, cutting through the static of fear. "No one leaves," he ordered, "until we understand what has happened." The order struck like a gavel, the doors shut with a quiet click, sealing the guests inside with their mounting suspicions. Evelyn, standing on the periphery, remained silent. She had already seen it, the one thing no one else had noticed, a single faint smudge at the edge of the glass case, barely visible under the glare of the chandeliers, a sign that someone had been exactly where they shouldn't have been. She turned, her gaze sweeping the room with the slow, measured patience of a hunter. Eyes darted from one face to another. Who was already sweating, who was standing too still, who had been waiting for this very moment to unfold. Captain Montrose's eyes landed on her, a brief hesitation, then Miss Hargrave. His voice dropped, edged with something between request and command. "I believe you have a knack for untangling matters such as these." Evelyn's lips curled ever so slightly. "A modest one, Captain." His expression remained unreadable. "I suspect modesty won't be necessary tonight." She exhaled, slow and measured, before taking a step toward the empty display, her fingers grazing the cool edge of the untouched glass. The sapphire had not vanished. No, something like the celestial tear didn't simply disappear, it had been claimed. The only question was by whom, and why did she already have the distinct feeling that this wasn't the end, but merely the beginning? Evelyn Hargrave sat in the dimly lit confines of Captain Elias Montrose's private quarters, the air thick with the scent of aged mahogany and brine. The celestial tear had vanished, but its absence was more than just a theft, it was an open challenge. The captain sat across from her, his broad shoulders tense, his fingers laced together atop the polished desk. Beyond the single fogged porthole, dawn had begun to stir, but inside this room, the night's shadows still lingered. "You understand the gravity of our situation," Montrose stated, his voice controlled, but edged with the weight of responsibility. Evelyn's gloved hands rested lightly in her lap, her posture relaxed, too relaxed for a woman thrust into such a crisis. "A stolen gem," she mused, her voice smooth, contemplative. "A ship teeming with suspects. A thief who, if they are as clever as they appear, has already planned their escape before we even set foot in New York." A single muscle in Montrose's jaw twitched. "Precisely, which is why I need you." He exhaled, running a hand over his face before leveling her with a sharp gaze. "Security will handle their inquiries, but you see things differently. I need that." "We all do." Evelyn allowed a small knowing smile. "A flattering assessment, Captain. But why would you trust me?" His expression remained unreadable, though his answer came without hesitation. "Because you haven't asked the obvious question yet." Evelyn tilted her head, intrigued. "And what question is that?" Montrose leaned forward. "How did the thief open a case that was never unlocked?" A charged silence hung between them. Evelyn had noticed it. The glass had been intact, no signs of tampering, no forceful entry, yet the sapphire had ceased to exist before their very eyes. A disappearing act performed in the heart of a crowded room, precise, deliberate, impossible. "Interesting," she murmured, breaking the silence, "and yet the answer isn't so impossible, if you consider the right perspective." Montrose arched a brow. "Which is?" Evelyn rose gracefully, smoothing the front of her tailored coat, her eyes drifting to the fogged porthole as though she could already see the puzzle assembling itself beyond the horizon. "The only trick worth performing is one that ensures the audience is looking the wrong way." She turned back to face him, her expression cool and composed. "I'll need access, unrestricted, to the passengers, the staff, and most importantly to anyone who was standing too close yet looking too far." Montrose considered her for a long moment before nodding. "Done. But discretion is paramount. If word of this gets out, panic will spread before we reach the shore." She finished for him. "I know, Captain, and a desperate thief is far more dangerous than a careful one." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Where will you start?" Evelyn picked up her gloves from the armrest, slipping them on with measured ease. "With those who have the most to lose." A pause, then a knowing glance, and those who have already planned what happens next. She strode toward the door, her mind already dissecting the web of deception that had begun to tighten around the ship. Somewhere on this vessel, someone had rewritten the rules of the game, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had done so in the presence of Evelyn Hargrave, and she never played a game she didn't intend to win. As Evelyn Hargrave stepped into the hushed corridor outside Captain Montrose's office, she allowed herself a moment to breathe in the charged silence. Somewhere aboard the SS Elysium, a thief believed themselves victorious, but she knew better. Even the most meticulously executed crime had its seams, a hurried word, a glance held a second too long, a single detail misjudged. Her gloved fingers brushed absently against the brass railing as she made her way toward the grand atrium, where whispers of scandal and speculation had already begun their inevitable spread. The celestial tear had vanished, but in its absence it had left something far more valuable, a trail. Stepping through the archway, she found the once opulent ballroom transformed into a stage of unease. Gilded chandeliers flickered above guests who now huddled in tight clusters, their laughter replaced by murmurs thick with apprehension. The velvet ropes surrounding the display case stood like a solemn boundary, marking the spot where wealth, vanity and folly had collided, and at its center, the empty pedestal, the shattered illusion of security. The thief had been bold, impossibly so. The glass had not been shattered, the locks not crudely forced. No, the job had been executed with such precision that the gem had simply ceased to exist before anyone's eyes. It was not just a theft, it was a statement. Evelyn let her gaze sweep the room, cataloguing every detail, the way Lady Ashcombe clutched her pearls with knuckles turned white, the restless pacing of Cordelia Ashcombe, too frantic, too desperate, too rehearsed. And then there was Edward Langley, the enigmatic financier, whose presence on this voyage had raised more than a few quiet speculations. Where had he been during the brief moment of darkness? And why did his posture betray a tension he so carefully sought to mask? Adjusting her hat with a measured motion, she approached the empty display case, her touch featherlight as she examined the smudges on the glass. The edges bore no signs of brute force, only the faintest imprint of something, a tool perhaps, slender and precise enough to disengage the lock without disturbing the surface. A clean theft practiced. Not the work of a desperate opportunist. This was the hand of a professional. A nervous steward lingered nearby, his small notepad trembling slightly in his grasp. She did not acknowledge him just yet. Instead, her gaze flickered toward Lady Ashcombe, who had finally lifted her head, her expression drawn and pale. The Ashcombe finances, Evelyn suspected, were in far worse condition than whispered rumors suggested. A family that once dripped in luxury now clinging desperately to appearances. Then a sharp intake of breath. "I wasn't there." Cordelia's voice cut through the silence, brittle with anxiety. "I had stepped away just for a moment. I didn't see anything." Evelyn turned, her expression unreadable. "Stepped away." Her voice was soft, but there was weight behind it. Cordelia's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "To the powder room." "But I know how this looks." A long pause, then a whisper, one not meant to be heard. "You don't understand," Lady Ashcombe murmured, her voice barely audible. "That sapphire, it wasn't just an heirloom, it was everything." A single tear traced the delicate line of her cheek. Evelyn held the moment, turning it over like a coin in her mind. The grand spectacle of the theft had eclipsed a deeper, more pressing truth. This crime had consequences far beyond stolen jewels. As the murmurs began to rise again, Evelyn stepped away from the crowd, her mind already assembling the pieces. The ship's hum beneath her feet was a steady reminder. Time was not a luxury they possessed. Somewhere aboard the SS Elysium, a thief walked unburdened, believing they had executed the perfect crime. They had made one mistake. They had done it in Evelyn Hargrave's presence, and she did not intend to let them forget it. The corridor stretched long and silent before Eleanor Graves, the hush broken only by the whisper of her measured steps on the plush carpet. The SS Dorian was a ship of grandeur, yet tonight, its elegance was marred by a crime that had sent ripples through the upper echelons of its privileged passengers. The Moonfire diamond had vanished, and somewhere aboard this floating palace, a thief reveled in their triumph too soon. As Ellen turned a corner, she found herself face to face with Julian Hawthorne, a man whose tailored perfection and quiet confidence spoke of someone used to slipping through the cracks of notice. "Miss Graves," he greeted smoothly, his voice carrying an amused lilt. "I imagine this has been quite the eventful evening for you." She regarded him with the same air of polite intrigue she offered all potential liars. "Indeed, Mr. Hawthorne," she replied, tilting her head just slightly. "One wonders what sort of mind could orchestrate such a feat." His lips twitched, the flicker of something unreadable passing through his gaze. "A bold one, certainly, though I imagine such expertise does not come without experience." Eleanor let the words settle, the weight of unspoken implications hanging between them. "You sound as though you've given the matter some thought," she observed. He chuckled, as if they were discussing a parlor trick rather than a grand theft, and made a small dismissive gesture. "Locks, mechanisms, security. I've always found them fascinating. A puzzle, really, but my expertise ends at curiosity, I assure you. A lie, too smooth, too practiced." "Idle curiosity," she echoed, her tone so light it barely touched the air. "And where, if I may ask, were you when the lights failed?" His smile did not falter, but something in his posture shifted, a near imperceptible hesitation leapt out for air. The crowd was stifling. How Eleanor mused, to be spared the confusion. Their eyes held for a moment too long before Hawthorne inclined his head. "I imagine you will unravel this mystery in no time, Miss Graves. You strike me as someone who sees far more than she." "An old habit," she replied smoothly, her own smile revealing nothing. As he excused himself, his movements measured but swift, Eleanor stood still, watching his departure, her fingers tapping lightly against her handbag. His words had been careful, but careful men often miscalculated just how much they revealed. His knowledge of security systems, his deflection, his conveniently absent alibi, all were threads to be pulled, knots to be unraveled, and yet he was not the only enigma aboard this ship. The theft of the Moonfire diamond had done more than rob a display case of its prize. It had unmasked desperation, ambition, and secrets long buried beneath civility. As she made her way toward the Ashford suite, where the once glorious family now clung to their last vestiges of prestige, she noted the faded grandeur that surrounded their name. The heavy drapes, the once exquisite furniture now bearing the telltale marks of age and haste. Lord Everett Ashford stood by the ornate fireplace, his fingers tightening around a crystal glass of aged brandy as she entered. He had invited her with a formality that bordered on reluctance, his carefully composed expression betraying the weight of something unspoken. Eleanor lowered herself into a well-worn chair, taking in the subtle signs of financial strain hidden beneath the illusion of wealth. "It is a delicate matter, Lord Ashford," she began, "but one cannot help but wonder why you chose to exhibit such a valuable gem, knowing the risks." His jaw tightened, and for a moment he did not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with quiet frustration. "I thought you were here to help recover the diamond, not question my judgment." "I find," she replied, her tone almost apologetic, "that the two are often closely linked. Motive, opportunity, these things rarely exist in isolation." His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time the weight of his reality seemed to crack through his carefully built facade. Turning away, he exhaled a slow, weary breath, his gaze fixed on the darkened porthole. "You must understand, Miss Graves, that the Ashford name once carried weight, influence. But now," he hesitated, his voice dropping to a murmur, "it is little more than a ghost of what it once was." Eleanor remained silent, allowing him to continue. "The estate, the family fortune, it is all but gone. We are drowning in debt, clinging to a reputation that no longer holds any substance. His fingers gripped the brandy glass tighter, exhibiting the moonfire diamond was not a mere display, it was a last chance, a desperate attempt to inspire confidence, to attract investors, perhaps even to secure a buyer. Eleanor watched him carefully, her mind turning over the implications. Desperation was a dangerous thing. It could lead a man to foolish risks, or calculated betrayals. The theft was no ordinary crime, it was a move on a larger, unseen chessboard, one where every player had something to lose. The only question that remained, who had the most to gain? As Eleanor stood to leave, the weight of the night pressed heavier upon her shoulders. A thief walked among them, thinking themselves victorious, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated Eleanor Graves, and she did not intend to let them remain hidden for long. The flickering lanterns in the dimly lit corridors of the SS Dorian cast long restless shadows as Eleanor Graves stepped further into the heart of the ship's mystery. The theft of the Moonfire diamond had torn open more than just the lavish display case. It had unraveled a web of secrets, greed and desperation that wove through the grand halls and dark underbelly of this floating palace. The weight of it pressed against her thoughts as she stood in the private suite of Lord Everett Ashford, watching him with the kind of piercing gaze that had unsettled far sharper men. He sat hunched in a leather armchair, a brandy glass trembling in his grip, his once impeccable composure cracking beneath the weight of what he had just admitted. A buyer. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but laced with steel. Lord Ashford's pale face gave away his turmoil before he even spoke. Yes, he exhaled, the single word heavy with regret. I had considered selling it. There was interest. An anonymous party reached out before we set sail. His fingers gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. But I never agreed to it, Miss Graves. I would never have arranged for it to be stolen. His voice faltered, and he buried his face in one hand, the other still clinging to the brandy. That gem was our last hope. Without it I fear we have nothing left. Eleanor leaned forward, her tone measured yet unyielding. Desperation, Lord Ashford, is a dangerous thing. It makes even the most honorable men vulnerable to manipulation. Are you certain no one knew of your intentions? A confidant? A servant? A misplaced letter? Ashford hesitated, his lips parting, then pressing together again as if struggling against the truth. I told no one outright, but these things have a way of slipping through the cracks. People talk. His admission hung between them, heavy and damning. Eleanor exhaled slowly, rising to her feet. One last thing, she said, pausing at the door. This anonymous buyer, did they contact you directly? Ashford hesitated again, then nodded, his voice a whisper. A letter, delivered to my cabin the morning we set sail. It suggested a meeting, but I destroyed it immediately. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her thoughts churned. How very prudent. She stepped out, leaving Lord Ashford alone with his unraveling legacy. The ship's lower decks were a world apart from the glittering ballrooms above, a labyrinth of narrow passageways, where the scent of oil, salt and damp wood clung to the air. Here, among the cargo holds and mechanical chambers, the truth often lay buried beneath secrecy and shadow. As Eleanor moved through the dim corridors, she noted the uneasy glances of passing stewards, the hushed murmurs of deckhands who knew better than to speak too loudly. Somewhere amid these steel walls and hidden compartments, a thief lurked. She turned a corner, and collided almost immediately with a figure slumped against the wall. A young steward, his uniform rumpled, his face pale and drawn. A dark bruise bloomed along his cheekbone, and his hands trembled as he struggled to steady himself. "Oh dear," Eleanor murmured, concern laced with calculation. "You've had a rough time of it, haven't you?" The steward's eyes flickered up, startled, then wary. He winced as he straightened. I'm fine, ma'am. Just an accident." Eleanor's lips curved slightly, but her gaze sharpened. "An accident? That bruise doesn't look accidental to me." The young man hesitated, then let out a slow, weary sigh. His shoulders sagged. "I suppose there's no use hiding it," he swallowed, his voice unsteady. I was down by the cargo hold, checking inventory when someone in a first-class suit jumped me. Eleanor's pulse quickened, though her expression remained unreadable. A first-class passenger. He nodded grimly, didn't say a word, just shoved me aside, and went rummaging through the crates. Rummaging, Eleanor echoed, her curiosity razor-sharp. For what? The steward shook his head, frustration flickering across his bruised face. I don't know, but he was desperate. Hurried, like he was looking for something specific. Eleanor's mind raced. The timing, the secrecy, the violence. Someone had been willing to attack a crew member just to search the cargo hold, an act too reckless for a calculated thief. Was the Moonfire diamond truly the only prize on this ship? She studied the steward, gauging the exhaustion in his frame, the slight tremor in his stance. And did you see where he went? No, ma'am. By the time I got up, he was gone. But I know this much, he wasn't crew, he was a passenger. He winced again, pressing a hand to his side. Eleanor reached out, steadying him with a firm hand. Come along, she said briskly. You need the infirmary, and I suspect you'll feel better after some rest. As they made their way back up the passageway, Eleanor's mind wove through the tangled threads of the night. A first-class passenger, a secret deal, a stolen jewel. By the time she had handed the steward over to the ship's nurse, a single certainty had settled in her mind. This was no ordinary theft. This was the opening move in a far more dangerous game. As she stepped into the corridor, adjusting her gloves, she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. And then, a presence. Just ahead, leaning nonchalantly against the wall, stood Julian Hawthorne. His tailored suit was immaculate, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his gaze, something calculating, assessing. A man who had been watching, waiting. Eleanor met his stare with quiet defiance. If he thought she would be easily deceived, he had gravely underestimated her. Somewhere aboard this ship, a thief was hiding in plain sight, and Eleanor Graves had no intention of letting them slip away. The grand ocean liner sliced through the midnight waves, its polished decks gleaming under the cold silver of the moon. The air was thick with salt and secrecy, a silent witness to the undercurrents of deception rippling beneath the vessel's opulent facade. Eleanor Graves, a woman of sharp perception and an unshakable mind, stood by the railings of the promenade deck, the gentle night breeze teasing the edges of her silk gloves. She had spent decades unraveling the tangled webs of deceit. But this was different. Somewhere aboard this ship, danger lurked, not as a distant possibility but a present, breathing force. Her thoughts were interrupted by the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind her. She turned slowly, her gaze cool and assessing as a man emerged from the dim light of a lantern, his presence neither abrupt nor entirely expected. Maxwell Finch, a gentleman of charm that concealed something far more calculating, inclined his head with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Graves, he murmured, his voice as smooth as the sea at dawn. I didn't take you for someone who enjoys solitary midnight musings. Eleanor's lips curved in a measured smile. And I didn't take you for someone who appears in places he has no reason to be. Finch chuckled, a rich sound that masked its own wariness. You wound me. Can a man not admire the beauty of the open sea? A man can, Eleanor agreed, her tone light but her eyes hard. But a man who was seen lingering near the cargo hold hours ago, and then outside the infirmary door, just minutes past, his reasons must be far more intricate. Finch tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his dark gaze. My dear Miss Graves, you do have a talent for placing people in the most intriguing of situations they have placed themselves in. She countered smoothly. Let's not pretend coincidence is at play here. The missing artifact, the unfortunate steward who was assaulted, the hushed whispers among the crew, every string leads back to you in some way. Tell me, Mr. Finch, are you simply a bystander in this mystery, or are you its orchestrator? His smile faltered, if only for a breath of a second, That is a bold accusation. I don't make accusations, Eleanor corrected. I make observations, and what I observe is a man too carefully positioned within this puzzle to be mere decoration. Finch exhaled through his nose, an almost silent laugh. He stepped closer, the faint scent of expensive cologne, and something sharper, gunpowder perhaps, clinging to him. And what if I told you, Miss Graves, that I am here for reasons that would serve your curiosity well? That my business aboard this ship may align more with your own than you realize? Eleanor didn't flinch, though the weight of his words settled heavily between them. Then I would say that trust is a currency not easily spent. And I would wonder, her voice dropped just slightly, her gaze pinning him in place, if you truly seek to uncover the truth, or to bury it deeper. Finch held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate bow of his head, he stepped back into the shadows. Until we meet again, Miss Graves, he murmured before vanishing into the quiet hum of the ship. Eleanor remained motionless, her pulse steady, her mind whirring. The game had begun in earnest, and the pieces were shifting swiftly. Whatever secrets Finch carried, she would unearth them. The night was deep, the ocean vast, and the truth dangerously close. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath the ship's prow, its obsidian depths reflecting the fractured silver of the low-hanging moon. A cold wind whispered through the vast emptiness of the promenade deck, teasing at the hem of Evelyn Blackwood's coat, as she walked with measured precision, her sharp gaze locked onto the lone figure, leaning against the rail. Nicholas Vane was a man of careful postures, always appearing at ease, yet never truly at rest. His silhouette, etched against the moonlit waves, exuded an air of quiet control, a man who knew more than he let on. Evelyn had watched him throughout the voyage, noting his peculiar tendency to appear wherever intrigue thickened, a shadow in the wake of secrets. She approached, her footsteps deliberately softened against the polished wood. "A beautiful night, Mr. Vane," she murmured, her voice carrying just enough warmth to veil the steel beneath. He turned slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, though his eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "Miss Blackwood, a pleasure as always. What brings you to the deck at such an hour? Restless thoughts? Observation?" she corrected smoothly. "A habit I find rather useful. And you, Mr. Vane? I wouldn't peg you as a man who indulges in idle stargazing." His smirk didn't waver, but the slightest flicker in his expression betrayed something sharper beneath. "Oh, you wound me," he drawled, turning his gaze back to the sea. "Perhaps I merely enjoy the serenity of the open ocean. Or perhaps," she countered, stepping closer, "you find the quiet useful for other purposes, such as avoiding unwanted attention." His chuckle was low, edged with something almost dangerous. "You give me too much credit, Miss Blackwood." "Do I?" Her tone remained poised, but her eyes, dark and discerning, missed one thing. A man seen near the cargo hold mere hours before a theft. A man loitering outside the infirmary when a certain steward was attacked. And now, standing alone beneath the moonlight, wearing the guise of a man without a care in the world. Curious, don't you think? Vane exhaled through his nose, his amusement dimming just a fraction. "You're not easily distracted, are you?" "Never," she said simply. Silence stretched between them, the wind carrying the distant murmur of the ship cutting through the waves. Then, with a slow, measured movement, Vane turned fully to face her. "And if I told you," he said, voice quieter now, "that my reasons for being here might align more closely with yours than you suspect?" Evelyn arched a single brow, considering him. "Then I would say you're still being deliberately vague, and I don't care much for vagueness." A smirk, this one slower, more deliberate. "Fair enough," he conceded. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "I'm here on business, Miss Blackwood. The kind of business that involves men who don't like their affairs scrutinized. I imagine you understand that well enough." "I understand many things," she replied. "But what I fail to understand is whether you are a hunter or merely another piece on the board, waiting to be sacrificed." He laughed, the sound softer now, yet still edged with something impenetrable. "Perhaps both," he mused. "But tell me, Miss Blackwood, if I were a piece, wouldn't you already know who was moving me?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead she studied him, every shift in his stance, every flicker in his gaze. Then at last she smiled, a knowing, secretive thing. "Oh, Mr. Vane," she murmured, turning away, "I intend to find out," and with that she walked past him, her steps unhurried, her mind already piecing together the strands of a mystery that ran deeper than she had anticipated. Behind her, Nicholas Vane remained by the rail, watching as the darkness swallowed her silhouette, a ghost of a smile lingering on his lips. The game had only just begun. The moonlight cast a silver spell over the restless sea, its glow reflecting off the ship's polished railings like a whispered secret. The night carried a peculiar tension, the kind that only those searching for hidden truths could sense. Eleanor Graves rested her hand on the cold metal, her fingers tracing its smooth surface as if trying to decipher the unseen forces at play. For hours, she had been watching, observing, waiting, and now standing before her was Silas Hargrove, a man whose silence spoke louder than his words, whose presence felt more calculated than casual. "Enjoying the night breeze, Mr. Hargrove?" Eleanor's voice was light, almost amused, but her eyes gleamed with sharp curiosity. Silas shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, yet his expression remained unreadable, calm, measured, and laced with something far too deliberate to be mere indifference. "Like you, Miss Graves, I was simply thinking that this night was made for more than just listening to the sea." Eleanor didn't move, only tilted her head slightly, as if analyzing every nuance of his reply. "Your name appears on the passenger list, but I doubt you're just another traveler." For the first time, Silas truly looked at her. His gaze was cool, assessing, as if every response had already been premeditated. "And you, are you only here to ask questions?" Her smile deepened. "I'm only here to determine whether this voyage is merely a journey, or a game." Silas inhaled slowly, as if weighing his next words. "If it is a game, Miss Graves, then the stakes are far higher than you realize. I am not just a passenger, and this voyage is no coincidence." Eleanor's gaze flickered, her fingers subtly easing their grip on the railing. "And if I told you I already knew that?" For the first time, Silas allowed himself a genuine smile, the kind that belonged to a hunter rather than prey. "Then perhaps, Miss Graves, you and I are on the same side, or perhaps we're on opposite ones." Her waves murmured in the background, as if laughing at the exchange, and Eleanor merely let her fingers relax against the cold metal. "We shall see, Mr. Hargrove, we shall see." The dim glow of the ship's lanterns barely reached the lower decks, where the scent of salt and aged timber clung to the air like a whisper of forgotten secrets. The Odessa Star was no ordinary vessel, and Evelyn Harrow knew it. Every step she took along the metal grating of the cargo hold felt like treading on a battlefield. Each shadow stretched long and menacing against the towering stacks of crates. Somewhere within this labyrinth of trade and deception, a truth lay buried, one that could either unmask a criminal empire, or send her plunging into the abyss. Behind her, Daniel Crown moved with practiced silence, his every step betraying the tension that coiled beneath his otherwise composed demeanor. "Out of time," he muttered, his voice barely above a breath. "If the exchange is happening at dawn, we need to find the stolen shipment before it vanishes." Evelyn ran her fingers along the worn surface of a crate, its markings nearly indistinguishable beneath years of dust and neglect. "It's not just about the shipment," she murmured. "It's about who benefits from its disappearance." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You think this is bigger than a smuggler?" She turned, her eyes sharp as the glint of a dagger. "Smugglers don't frame people, Daniel. But someone on this ship wants to see an empire fall, and they've orchestrated this theft to ensure it happens." A sudden creak from the far end of the hold sent a jolt through the silence. The flittons barely illuminated the figure that emerged from between the stacked cargo, hitting a jagged outline against the dim light. A deckhand, or something more. Daniel's hand hovered near the concealed blade at his belt. "You lost?" he called out. The figure took another step, his face coming into view, a lean man with wary eyes, sweat glistening at his brow. His voice wavered as he spoke. "You shouldn't be down here." Evelyn held his gaze, unflinching. "Neither should you." For a moment the hold was still, the tension stretching unbearably thin. Then, with a subtle shift of his stance, the man bolted. "Damn it!" Daniel lunged after him, the echo of their pursuit rattling through the metal chambers. Evelyn followed, weaving through the maze of crates as the chase twisted through the underbelly of the ship. The man was fast, too fast for a mere deckhand. He knew the ship's layout well, slipping through narrow passageways with an urgency that screamed of guilt. Evelyn's pulse thrummed as she rounded a corner, only to find herself facing empty space. Gone, the man had vanished into the dark, leaving nothing behind but the steady hum of the ship, and the undeniable proof that they weren't just chasing stolen goods anymore. Daniel caught up, breathless. Where the hell did he go? Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the corridor. The stolen shipment was just the beginning. Someone had orchestrated this theft to set the stage for something far more dangerous, and now, with dawn approaching, the game had truly begun. The dim lantern light flickered against the wooden beams of the cargo hold, casting restless shadows that seemed to shift with every creak of the ship. Eleanor Vance pressed herself deeper into the narrow space between stacked crates, her breath steady but her pulse thrumming like a war drum. Across from her, Inspector James Calder held up a hand, a silent command for stillness. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, each step betraying a calculated patience. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and draped in an unremarkable coat, yet his movements were precise, his intent sharp as a blade. He reached for a crate, prying it open with practiced efficiency. His fingers ghosted over its contents, searching, and then a sharp curse escaped his lips. Whatever he sought, it wasn't there. Without another moment's hesitation, he turned and vanished back into the labyrinth of cargo. Eleanor let out a slow exhale. "He's looking for something specific," she murmured, brushing the dust from her sleeve as she emerged from hiding. "Not just any contraband, something important." Calder's jaw tightened, "and something he's willing to take a risk for, which means we're closing in." The Ashford estate had once stood as a beacon of wealth and prestige, but now, its very name carried the weight of scandal. Within the dimly lit study, Lord William Ashford sat rigidly in a leather chair, his hands gripping the arms with the desperation of a man on the edge of ruin. Lady Margaret Ashford paced the room, her silk gown swishing against the floor in restless agitation. Eleanor's presence was quiet but commanding as she stepped forward, leveling her gaze at the beleaguered nobleman. "Tell me, Lord Ashford," she said calmly, "who exactly was this mysterious buyer you intended to meet?" He hesitated, his fingers twitching against the upholstery. "A man approached me, said he knew of our troubles, that..." His voice cracked on the word. "The price was humiliatingly low, but I had no choice." Lady Ashford halted mid-step, her eyes flashing with betrayal. "You were willing to sell it, the family's legacy." Ashford closed his eyes. "I thought I was saving us." Eleanor leaned in, her voice edged with quiet intensity. "And now the gem is gone, and the buyer has disappeared. Tell me, Lord Ashford, did you ever see his face?" A pause, a flicker of memory, then barely above a whisper, he said, "No." Calder, standing near the fireplace, exhaled sharply. "That's because he never intended to buy it. He intended to take it." The lounge bar was nearly empty, the rich scent of aged whiskey curling through the air as glasses clinked softly behind the counter. Calder sat across from Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "The name Ashford gave us matches an alias we've come across before, a man known as Elias Kincaid." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Smuggler, thief, and if our suspicions are correct, a man who doesn't operate alone." Eleanor tapped her fingers lightly against the table. He's clever, but he's made one mistake. Calder lifted a brow. And what's that? She smiled faintly. He underestimated us. The air between them crackled with quiet resolve. The game was far from over, but now they were the ones setting the rules, and by sunrise, Eli would learn that even the best thieves could not outrun the truth. The polished oak desk gleamed under the soft glow of the cabin's overhead lamp, its rich surface marred only by the weight of the conversation unfolding. Eleanor Vance sat with practiced ease, her hands folded neatly as she faced Graves, a man whose deep-lined face spoke of years at sea. Across the cabin, Inspector James Calder stood by the porthole, his silhouette carved against the dawn-hued waves beyond. The hum of the ship's engines pulsed beneath them, a rhythmic, steady heartbeat amidst the tension thickening in the room. "You want me to do what?" Graves exhaled, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "Leak information to the passengers." "That's highly irregular, Miss Vance. Dangerous even." Eleanor met his gaze, her voice calm but edged with resolve. "It's a necessary risk, Captain. We are not dealing with a common thief. We are dealing with someone who is precise, calculating, and desperate. If we wait for him to the opportunity may slip through our fingers, but if we control the narrative, we can force his hand." Calder nodded, arms crossed over his chest. "He's right here, on this ship, Captain, and he knows we're closing in. The only way to flush him out is to make him believe there's something more, something worth taking another risk for." Graves hesitated, his stern gaze shifting between them, then exhaled sharply. "And you're certain this will work?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Desperation, Captain, is the great revealer of intent." A long pause, then finally, Graves nodded. "Very well, but I want this handled quietly. No panic, no reckless moves." "Of course," Eleanor assured him, "this will be precise. A game of patience. And trust me, Captain, our thief is running out of time." The grand lounge shimmered under the soft golden glow of the overhead chandeliers. Mahogany panels reflected the ambient light, giving the room an almost ethereal warmth, though beneath the surface, a different kind of tension crackled in the air. The murmur of polite conversation flowed around the clinking of glasses, but Eleanor Vance was not interested in idle pleasantries. She sat near the far end of the room, the embroidery in her lap, nothing more than a prop, her keen eyes drifting across the gathering like a predator studying its prey. Across from her, Calder leaned against the bar, his whiskey untouched, his casual stance disguising his watchfulness. And at the heart of it all, playing his part with measured ease, was Lord Victor Blackwood, dressed impeccably in a midnight blue suit. Blackwood's voice carried just enough to be overheard as he spoke to his acquaintance. "One must be cautious," he mused, taking a sip from his glass, "particularly with valuables of significant historical importance. Fortunately, my family heirlooms are quite secure." His words were bait, cast into the sea of eavesdropping ears, and Eleanor, ever the silent observer, did not miss the way one particular figure stiffened at the remark. A man, tall and sharply dressed, with a meticulously groomed mustache, hesitated mid-motion, his drink hovering just short of his lips. Then, with a calculated nonchalance, he approached. "Pardon my intrusion," the man said smoothly, his accent touched with the lilt of the continent, "but I could not help overhearing. You speak of heirlooms, Lord Blackwood. Might I inquire further?" Blackwood offered him a pleasant smile. "Ah, monsieur, Renard," the man supplied with a small practiced bow. "Lucien Renard." Calder's grip on his glass tightened, his mind already racing. Eleanor remained utterly still, but she knew, the name was an alias, but the man behind it was real. Lucien Renard, known smuggler, master of deception, and the very man they had been waiting for. Blackwood gestured for him to sit, his demeanor unbothered. "Tell me, Monsieur Renard, what is it you wish to know?" Renard's smile did not quite reach his eyes. A mere professional curiosity, Lord Blackwood. I happen to be a collector of rare artifacts myself, and I always have an interest in unique acquisitions. His words were measured, probing, testing the waters, and Ellen, ever perceptive, saw it for what it was, a thief searching for his next mark. The moment was delicate, razor-thin in its balance, and then with the slightest tilt of her head, she gave the signal. Calder moved without hesitation, stepping forward and placing a firm hand on Renard's shoulder. I think that's quite enough, Renard. The smuggler's body stiffened beneath his grip, but he did not panic. Instead, his lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Ah, he murmured. So the game begins. Eleanor allowed herself the faintest of smiles. No, Monsieur Renard, she corrected gently. The game ends. The dim glow of the cargo hold's lanterns cast long flickering shadows against the towering crates, their wooden surfaces etched with markings from distant ports. The ship's engines thrummed beneath the floor, a steady, relentless pulse in the thick silence. Eleanor Vance stood at the center of it all, her composed demeanor unshaken as she regarded the man before her. Lucien Renard sat slumped against a crate, his wrists bound, his usual air of charm reduced to a thin veneer barely masking his frustration. Inspector Calder stood nearby, his stance rigid, while two crewmen flanked the exits, their postures tense, ready. You know what you've done. Calder's voice was low, edged with steel. Let's not make this difficult. For a moment Renard's body tensed as if poised to bolt, but before the impulse could manifest, Calder's grip tightened, and the crewman took a step forward, cutting off any possible escape route. Realizing the inevitable, Renard exhaled sharply, slumping back, his polished facade cracking at the edges. You have no proof, he muttered, his usual arrogance laced with a tinge of doubt. Perhaps not yet, Eleanor said, stepping forward, her voice smooth yet unyielding. But we don't need proof, do we? Not when everything else fits so perfectly. Your interest in the Blackwood heirlooms, your presence near the cargo manifest, the conveniently timed questions about the ship's security. A man like you is precise, Monsieur Renard, but even precision leaves a pattern. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his eyes, a twitch of his jaw, the smallest betrayal. Even if you've caught me, he said slowly, you'll never find it. Oh, but we will, Eleanor countered, her gaze unwavering. Because you are not the sort to discard something so valuable. No, you've hidden it somewhere within these walls, in a place only you would consider safe. The air crackled with anticipation as Renard remained silent, his expression betraying nothing, but his stillness, his refusal to deny, was answer enough. Time is of the essence, she murmured, turning on her heel. And I dare say we have a few more moves left to play before this game is through. The search commenced with a quiet urgency, the crew moving methodically through the towering stacks of cargo. Lantern light glinted off crates marked with symbols of trade, the insignias of distant merchants, and the occasional smuggler's crest. Metal crowbars pried open wooden panels, revealing contents that ranged from silken fabrics to bottles of rare liquor, but no sign of what they sought. The air grew thick with the scent of aged wood and dust, as time dragged on, and Calder, ever the pragmatist,